I'm really thrilled to be able to introduce another one of those people that's been so influential in bringing these messages to an approachable format for the public that's benefited so many people over the years. And her new book is out in the back. You can take a look at it, the revised version of her Primal Body, Primal Mind. Excellent read. And so I would like to welcome Nora Gedgaudas here, who's going to be talking about the Primal Mind, nutrition and mental health. Put your hands together to welcome you.
Thank you so much. I mean, what an amazing honor to be here. This is just an incredible collection of people, incredible collection of ideas, and I hope we do lots more of it. I'm kind of pinching myself a little bit, actually, here, sharing the stage with some of the people that have been here. So I am, among other things, a clinical neurofeedback practitioner in Portland, Oregon. And actually, I was going to start actually with this slide here. It was a quote. So the statistics on sanity are that 1 out of every 4 Americans is suffering from some form of mental illness. Think of your 3 best friends. If they're okay, it's you. It's Rita Mae Brown. Anyway, so the way I come into this, and this particular topic here is from a perspective of having been a neurofeedback practitioner for the last 15 years. And basically, I spend all day, every day, sitting in a tiny little room and training people's brains. And neurofeedback is a very sophisticated and very highly specific form of brain training that helps people gain a sort of a functional and regulatory control of their brains and central nervous systems by basically learning to exercise their own brainwave activity. And it's a process that gives people information about their own brain functions, so basically their brains can manage their own states. It's elegant, it's simple in a way, but it's also extremely powerful. And I see a little bit of everything. I probably get the most calls in my practice from people suffering from issues surrounding anxiety and depression and ADD-related issues, but I see a little bit of everything. I see bipolar disorder, I see a lot of autism, I see a lot of Asperger's, I see seizure disorders, I see closed head injury types of cases, and I also work with a lot of people. I've actually worked with some rather well-known people, can't name names, but who didn't necessarily have a lot of complaints, but just wanted to get better at what they already did well. So as a form of brain exercise, it's just a great way of optimizing brain function. So the way I look at the brain from that perspective is being fundamentally bioelectric. And all bioelectric, so the brain is, in other words, it's more than just simply a hodgepodge of psychological constructs, as one would come to from this perspective, maybe a psychologist or whatever. And it's more than just simply a vessel of chemical soup. But the brain is also bioelectric. And all biochemical reactions in the body and brain are essentially preceded by an electrical depolarization of the cell. And that electrical depolarization of the cell is intimately dependent upon certain timing mechanisms. And those timing mechanisms are largely generated by a part of the brain called the thalamus. And the thalamus, it just so happens to be what we're more or less directly appealing to with this process. And so so in helping to help the brain regulate a little bit better its bioelectric processes, we come to a place of helping the brain manage its own states a great deal better. It also streamlines a great deal with respect to some of the biochemical things, as long as the brain has what it needs. And that brings us to some other things. But we look upon many brain-based issues as basically being related to dysregulated timing mechanisms and also phase relationships that are largely due to stressors on some level, whether the stressors are physical, psychological, emotional, or physiological. Stress is stress and can impact the brain in a very similar manner. So rather than compartmentalizing the brain in the way we look at it, we recognize each dysregulation, nobody ever comes in with one thing. People walk in and they say, yeah, you know, I'm depressed. Also, you know, I have trouble sleeping. And by the way, I get migraines a lot. And oh, by the way, I'm kind of anxious and I don't pay attention very well. Well, you know, that's a half dozen things. And if you were to go to an MD or you go to a psychologist or a psychiatrist or something, you would basically be looking at a half dozen different disorders for which you would maybe receive a half dozen different prescriptions. Instead, the way I look upon these things as all being each part of a larger constellation or spectrum related to dysregulated arousal. So, just to give you some background. And the bottom line is, though, that as great as this is, the best psychotherapy, brain training, or any medication, whatever it is you've got, can't put a nutrient there that's not there. Can't take away some offending substance that doesn't belong there. The brain and the body need certain raw materials in order to function, period. And so what I find is that, you know, I see what I get with neurofeedback, and then we see what's left over. And when people are open to it, then we start talking turkey with, you know, with all this stuff. So the bottom line is that it's really no fun being a prisoner in your own nervous system, and that's what I see every day. I see people basically at the mercy of, like, their brain is like a horse riding around with no reins. And this is exactly what I deal with. It's lots of fun. So stress, of course, being the big culprit here. Welcome to the modern world. It's a good thing, I think, to define stress and understand really what it is. Well, stress is not necessarily what happens to us. It is how we respond to what happens to us. And of course, it's mitigated by a part of the brain called the temporal lobes, and there's something called the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. And this is part of our limbic system, which is our emotional or more primal brain, if you will. And so the hypothalamus is very much attuned to perceptions, of course, of what you do and about what you do and don't perceive as stressful. And of course, biochemistry is in part an outgrowth of that response. And here's just sort of a general, you know, thing of the, you know, I deal with a lot of amygdala issues, it turns out, but at any rate, the limbic brain. So then we need to look at what are emotions. Well, if you want to know what emotional states are, if we're looking at how it is that we perceive stress and how, you know, what our beliefs are about it, well, emotions are just simply biochemical storms in the body and the brain. And the healthier your biochemistry, of course, the better the emotional and also cognitive forecast. So you need to keep in mind here that we see absolutely everything through this lens that is our blood sugar stability, the degree to which you're dependent on it, and we'll get to that, our hormones and our neurotransmitters. This is how we interpret the entire world around us. We're human beings. You know, we wake up in the morning and you happen to be in a hypoglycemic funk because you've made yourself metabolically dependent on blood sugar for your primary source of fuel. You're going to feel basically like crap. You're going to wake up and you're going to look at the world through that lens, and it's human nature to try to make sense of that, to try to give meaning to that somehow. So you'll be like, well, why do I feel like this? Ugh, it's because my relationship sucks, or my job sucks, or the world sucks, or whatever. And that is the lens through which you're seeing things. At any given time, we all have a choice of really, and we all have great things happening in our lives and lousy things happening in our lives that we could choose to focus on. Why do we choose to focus on one thing or another? Some of it is habitual patterns, but a lot of it has to do with this lens. So this is a critical piece that gets overlooked, I think. So this mind-body connection thing, you know, yes, the brain is in large measure connected to the body, well, in most people anyway. And I can think of a few exceptions, but I won't name names. So basically, in my humble view, that okay, there we go. The idea of the mind-body connection is a total myth. Why? Because there isn't any fundamental separation from mind and body. These are both part of the same functioning or dysfunctioning system that need to be understood together in context. And of course, mental and physical health are unavoidably linked. So, both the brain and body need certain raw materials in order to function. And the hint here, it's not donuts. So without these raw materials, no amount of any therapy of any kind is going to ever have optimal or lasting results. And to quote the wonderful biochemist Candace Pert, our body is our subconscious mind. And anybody who thinks their conscious mind is running the show is seriously mistaken. In fact, the conscious mind may just be the most narcissistic entity in the universe. It thinks it's running the show. It's not. So these are some of the topics I'm going to cover here in abbreviated format, actually. I'm going to be giving, some one-day-long seminars on this topic, and this is going to be the auctioneer version today. I'm hoping to get through everything, and this is not everything. This part of it here is really all I have, time to go into a little bit today, but some of these other things are topics that I go into in a great deal more depth, both in my book and in my upcoming talks on the subject. So, I'm not a one-note person. I know we got a lot of low-carb people here, and I'm definitely a low-carb advocate. However, there's this old adage, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, and this is definitely, I don't come from that perspective. However, I will tell you that blood sugar issues are extremely pivotal when it comes to mental health issues. They're foundational to the regulation of all endocrine function, and they're extremely important, if not key contributors, to many issues surrounding mental health. So blood sugar surges will generate concomitant surges of both insulin and leptin, so elegantly spoken of by Dr. Lustig this morning. What a great talk. And each of these will have the effect of stimulating sympathetic overarousal, which will generate or exacerbate excitatory activity in the brain. And I'm telling you, this is a runaway problem. Blood sugar surges also are enormously destabilizing neurologically, hormonally, behaviorally, and emotionally. It's huge. So the other issue, of course, is that we've got this little thing called advanced glycosylation end products that I talk about in my book. But glucose in the bloodstream basically auto-oxidizes, and this produces potent free radical activity that damages tissues, forming cross-links with these proteins called advanced glycosylation end products. And they're known to accelerate age-associated declines in the functioning of cells, including brain cells and other tissues, causing mutations in DNA. And this leads to deterioration of brain function over time and increased risk for cancers in all of us. We all have blood sugar, regardless of whether we're a low-carb person or a high-carb person. It's a question of degrees and how rapidly this occurs. So, what are the implications for mental health? Well, these surges of blood sugar are a really common source of depression, anxiety, mania, mood swings, hyperactivity, irritability, violent tendencies, and cognitive and attention-related dysfunction. I see this every day in my clients, and when we apply some of these principles I'll be talking about, I invariably see improvements, sometimes radical improvements in these populations that just has a wonderfully enhancing effect on brain training. And think about it too, if you're dependent on blood sugar for a primary source of fuel and you come in and you're hypoglycemic, your brain's got nothing to work on. So getting that under control, or better yet, eliminating blood sugar from that mood and cognitive equation, in my view, is the way to go. Blood sugar surges also deplete the body of magnesium and also B-complex vitamins, which are essential to normal, healthy, and calm neurological functioning. Addressing these blood sugar issues are essential to mental health and stability. I just touch upon this. Glycation is a primary cause of brain degeneration, aging, and also Alzheimer's. It's basically a state of advanced brain neuropathy. It's not unlike the peripheral neuropathy in diabetics. And if you notice with anybody with Alzheimer's, every single Alzheimer's patient I've ever met has a sweet tooth that just won't quit. And these beta amyloid proteins, which are sort of these glycated tangles of proteins, will clump and stick together in the brain and eventually cause the symptoms later identified as Alzheimer's disease. I'm saying glycation is part of the process. I don't know that it's fully causative, but it's part of the equation. Well, what are some of the other brain consequences? The same sort of damage that you see in alcoholics, in the brains of alcoholics, also occurs at a slow, steady rate, basically with all of us, eating a sugar, starch-rich diet over time. This has implications for memory function, mood lability, cognitive decline, and attentional disorders of all kinds. And the loss of magnesium with these blood sugar surges also leave binding sites, magnesium binding sites, vulnerable to accumulations of things like aluminum and other toxic metals, which I would be very interested to see, actually, studies that make that correlation. I'll bet there is one. So here we have the impact of glycation on the brain long term. And interestingly, too, you oftentimes see in elderly brains very similar sort of neurodegeneration that occurs over time. Again, this type of degeneration is happening with all of us to one degree or another. It's just a matter of degrees and a matter of speed. So what are the additional consequences of chronic excess carbohydrate consumption? Oh, and by the way, with respect to Denise Minger's talk, which was amazing, I can tell you from my own experience as a clinician, and I am not alone among my colleagues, that by far the most damaged, intractably damaged brains and nervous systems I have ever encountered have to the letter been vegetarians and especially vegans. These brains and nervous systems sometimes are so severely neurologically damaged that a good deal of it may even be irreversible. It's a very, very difficult thing. These are tough, tough clients to help because you can brain train till the cows come home, but if the brain doesn't have what it needs in order to function well, it's very, very difficult to reach these populations. So here are some of the additional consequences. And again, I see this all the time, every day. Serotonin depletion, magnesium depletion, and I'm just going to put these up here. You know. And so don't let this happen to you. All right, neurological stability. Nothing is more destabilizing to the brain and nervous system than blood sugar surges and food sensitivity reactions. I will add to that. And nothing is more stabilizing to the brain than natural dietary fat. Nothing. We're going to touch on something called gluten here. It's a very big issue, and it's a much bigger issue, I think, than anybody realizes. Wherever neurological or cognitive, attentional, or mood-based issues present, gluten sensitivity and or celiac disease should always be included as a suspect. So in an article in the journal Neurology, states that gluten sensitivity can be primarily and at times exclusively a neurological disease, affecting not only the brain and nervous system directly, but also cognitive and psychiatric illness. So everybody thinks of it as a gut issue. By the way, 7 or 8 out of 10 celiac sufferers actually have no gastrointestinal symptoms. Okay, more than a word. In the Journal of Neurology, Neurosurgery, and Psychiatry, the article states that, quote, our finding implies that immune response triggered by sensitivity to gluten may find expression in organs other than the gut, and the peripheral and central nervous systems are particularly susceptible. More to consider. Study published in 2009 in the peer-reviewed journal Gastroenterology compared 10,000 available blood samples from individuals 50 years ago to 10,000 people today and found that there has been a 400% increase in the incidence of full-blown celiac disease, which is a bit of a redundant statement, and I'll get to that in a second. Because the only way celiac disease actually gets diagnosed, this is the standard of diagnosis. You know, inside the small intestine, we have these microvilli that look like shag carpeting lining the inside of the small intestine. These little villi and microvilli are where we absorb our nutrients. It's all the extra surface area that allow us to absorb the food that we eat. And in the process of celiac disease, what occurs is that this shag carpeting eventually kind of erodes away and basically becomes Berber, right? You are not diagnosable with celiac disease until this has become this. If you go and you get a biopsy and it looks like this, you're fine, go home, have some bread. You are not diagnosable until total damage has occurred, and this is the standard of diagnosis. So if you've been told you don't have it, I don't know. I'm not saying that you do, but I'm saying that that's open to question. So ponder this. Really only and by the way, celiac is the #1 most common autoimmune disease on the planet today, and only an estimated 1% of all suffering gluten sensitivity or celiac disease is ever diagnosed. Maybe a few people in this room. And also this, food sensitivity reactions will impact blood sugar and insulin even on a very low carbohydrate diet. And I'm not talking about, just, eating the occasional, bit of grain or whatever. I'm talking about even trace exposure is enough to unravel you. And that's something that's not well understood at all. So why pick on poor gluten? There's so many other food sensitivities to be had. Well, gluten can be looked upon, I think, somewhat as a bit of a gateway food sensitivity. It's known to increase an enzyme in the body known as zonulin, sort of unique among food sensitivities. And this controls intestinal permeability. So we have these tight junctures in our small intestine that really are very selective in their willingness to allow things to get through into your bloodstream. When you consume gluten and you produce this enzyme in response to that called zonulin, which is produced in also response to other things like the polysaccharides, the junctures do this. And now, basically, elevated zonulin levels in the presence of gluten will allow anything to get through. And in time, this can start triggering other immunologic reactions to other foods. So, virtually anything can get through. The immune system starts recognizing undigested, partially digested peptides and begins mounting an immune response, and eventually you could be reacting to anything. You could react to everything eventually. Now, casein is very similar in its molecular structure to gluten, very, very, very similar. It's one of the most common co-sensitivities with gluten, but again, the immune system can come to react to almost anything if gluten consumption persists. And this, of course, can be a very real problem. Once the multiple food sensitivities and multiple chemical sensitivity and everything start taking over, you start this vicious cycle that just really only worsens in time and becomes very difficult to correct. And this is a miserable thing to live with at best. And again, I see this all the time. It is a very interesting, and it is surmountable, but there's so much misunderstanding about this that it takes a bit of an education, and then it takes some systematic and hard work to get past it. So here's something to be keeping in mind here. Being mostly gluten-free is like saying, I'm just a little bit pregnant. You either are or you're not. And only total and permanent abstinence from gluten, even in trace amounts, can lead to restored health in a person that is gluten sensitive. And again, all celiac disease is gluten sensitivity, but not all gluten sensitivity is celiac disease. Gluten sensitivity encompasses a wider spectrum, and that needs to be appreciated because it's also autoimmune in nature. So now we're going to get into these anxiety-related disorders, which, by the way, are currently absolutely epidemic. I would say I see probably more anxiety-related issues per capita than any other thing, and maybe everything else combined, although so many things are within that sort of spectrum. And again, I look at these things within a spectrum. So we have things like panic disorders, which we view neurologically as a form of instability, some forms of ADHD and OCD. Now, autism, of course, is autoimmune in nature, Asperger's also. Believe it or not, bipolar disorder may have an autoimmune component. It's not traditionally viewed as an autoimmune disease, but there are researchers now in the field of immunology, a guy by the name of Rhesus who just opened Cyrex Labs, world-class immunologist, published over 200 studies in the field of immunology, is finding now high levels or significant numbers of people with bipolar presenting with serotonin antibodies. So, and people with Parkinson's showing up with dopamine antibodies, and also people with depression with serotonin antibodies. So these kinds of things are extremely common. Chronic pain, PTSD, and certain forms, of course, of insomnia. So what are the nutritional considerations? Well, again, carbs and blood sugar regulation, we have to start there. And, protein and amino acids, are you getting sufficient protein? And is that protein being sufficiently digested into its component amino acids so that you can make the neurotransmitters that then produce things like serotonin and GABA and whatever else that you need in order to regulate your nervous system. Again, digestion is huge. I mean, we can be eating the best quality paleo diet that there is on the planet, and if you can't digest it, then at best you're not doing yourself very much good, and at worst you may even be doing yourself some harm. So digestive issues, and particularly if you're coming from a vegetarian or vegan diet, these are issues that really need to be intelligently addressed, I think, in order for recovery to be something that is going to be reliable. Food sensitivity issues, huge, huge, huge with anxiety-related issues. Dehydration, sometimes it's just that simple, just the need to drink enough water. Anemia, wow, iron, B6 or B12 anemia, all three can have a tremendous impact on anxiety. And one of the reasons for this is that a part of the brain that is often overheated, so to speak, in anxiety riddled individuals are the basal ganglia, again, part of the limbic system. And the basal ganglia are very, very oxygen dependent. And of course, if you're anemic, you are not, you don't have enough hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is not carrying oxygen to some of these critical parts of the brain, and so these parts of the brain become disinhibited. And if I have an anxious person, I do a lot of functional blood chemistry analysis in my office. I differentiate that from the type of blood chemistry analysis you get at your doctor's office. I'm really just sort of looking for imbalances in things and comparing people to normative values. In other words, people that are normal and healthy instead of the lab ranges, which basically aren't based on anything scientific. In fact, lab ranges aren't standardized for much of anything with the exception of lipid panels, so everybody can get on Lipitor. And that isn't even based, those standardizations aren't even based on anything scientific. They're quite arbitrary. And all the lab range is really representative of is everyone that went into that particular lab system for blood work. So you're not getting compared to normal and healthy at your doctor's office. You're getting compared to everyone who went into that lab system for blood work. You're getting compared to the guy standing in front of you in line waiting for the blood draw who was carrying the oxygen tank, and the woman in front of him, you know, who was on her second round of chemo, and the person in front of them who was, you know, checking up on what was happening with their glucophage medication. And again, the American Association of Clinical Chemists, American Endocrine Society agreed that this is a very real problem, and a lot of people are falling through the cracks. And they've created what can be termed functional ranges, which are instead based upon a population deemed to be, and we'll throw quotes around it, normal and healthy. In other words, not having any symptoms right now, not on any medications. And these ranges are instead, they're much narrower. But you have much, much fewer people falling through the cracks with this. It's a much more meaningful range to a person who just wants to know, how do I compare to normal and healthy? And if you're outside of that functional range, it doesn't mean you have pathology. We're just looking at, there's an area of imbalance. And so, anyway, this is something that I look at routinely. Minerals like magnesium, iron, iodine, and zinc are also critical to these issues. You know, I also look at what kinds of things people are self-medicating with, cravings. Sometimes people, they have tons of chocolate cravings. Sometimes that can be an indication for a need for magnesium. And dietary fat intake. The low-fat diets or EFA deficiencies and fat-soluble nutrient deficiencies like vitamin D and whatnot, and vitamin A, also can be contributory to these conditions. And then there's a little something called pyroluria I talk about in my book. I will not talk about it today, but you can look it up there. It's a genetic metabolic disorder that I run into more often than you'd think. So, again, blood sugar issues, #1 most powerfully influencing factor, followed by gluten sensitivity, is a very close second. Insulin and leptin dysregulation are both generated by chronic blood sugar surges, and both stimulate sympathetic overarousal. And chronic blood sugar dysregulation leads to excess cortisol and adrenaline production, metabolic syndrome, and increased potential for food sensitivities. And there is this whole metabolic cycle around metabolic syndrome that, and there's a complex diagram that I didn't include here, unfortunately, but it does lead to that. So again, chronic blood sugar surges will cause magnesium loss, and magnesium is, of course, necessary for normal parasympathetic functioning. This is huge. And insulin, of course, is needed to store intracellular magnesium, and magnesium is needed to produce and utilize insulin. Insulin resistance is depleting of and prevents retention of magnesium. And again, note, magnesium loss also results in elevated histamine levels. A lot of times, you know, during certain times of the year when things are blooming or whatever, sometimes you see kind of kids starting to get hyperactive again or agitated. And I start asking, you know, does your kid have seasonal allergies? Oh, yeah. Well, histamine basically functions as an excitatory neurotransmitter. And depressed magnesium actually elevates histamine even more. Excess carbs also lead to an increased demand for B complex, especially B1, B6, and may readily lead to deficiencies. High carb diets tend to be poor protein utilization diets. High carbohydrate consumption can lead, of course, to yeast overgrowth, which has its own vector for anxiety-related issues, sleep disturbances, hypoglycemia and reactive hypoglycemia, big time, and premature aging. So our hero of the day, dietary fat and mental health. So what are the roles of fat in mental health? Well, fats make up 60 to 80% by dry weight of the brain, and about half of this, by the way, is saturated fat. In fact, why do you suppose that so much of the fat in our body is saturated? I'll give you a hint. We're not refrigerated. I mean, with all this talk that's given to antioxidants, people forget that saturated fat by its very nature is inherently resistant to oxidation. And your body uses it to actually protect those delicate polyunsaturated fats and also help your body better utilize them. The lining of our lungs is made up of a disaturate molecule. We want that because that's what's protective of the lungs against oxidative onslaught. Now, about 11% of the brain is arachidonic acid, evil arachidonic acid, and about 25% of the fatty acids in the brain, the essential fatty acids, are DHA, which of course is that elongated and state omega-3. And by the way, the note, and Craig Stanford I'm sure could address this too, the dominant essential fatty acid in the non-human primate brain is an omega-6. So we're not monkeys. Some people maybe. Anyway, the richest concentration of cholesterol in the human body is in the human brain. 25% of the body's repository of cholesterol is in the brain. And we need it for normal neurological, cognitive, and mood functioning. I'm telling you, some of the people that I see on statin drugs, one of their common complaints is, I can't remember things, I get confused, and it's seriously problematic. Fats are essential to the absorption of certain nutrients. Fats and cholesterol are essential for the formation of certain hormones. Fats and cholesterol are essential for the structure and healthy functioning of our cell membranes. Fats and cholesterol are essential for a healthy and stable nervous system. Continued. Ample fats are critical to the formation of the brain and nervous system in prenatal nutrition and in the developing brains and nervous systems of babies, children, and teens. I can't emphasize this strongly enough. These low-fat diets should never, ever, ever be promoted, particularly in these populations. In my view, it's genocide. So just take a look at the role of dietary fat in primitive cultures. All primitive and traditional cultures revered and coveted sources of dietary fat. The Plains and Northern Indians used pemmican, over which entire wars were fought. But you don't have to fight wars at all. You can go right over U.S. wellness meats. They've got great pemmican. Canadian tribes relished moose fat. Coastal Salish tribes used something called ulican grease, which is really similar, actually, in its fatty acid composition to human body fat. Very interesting. The Inuit eat and also ate large amounts of seal, walrus, and whale fat. The Inus of northern Canada coveted caribou fat. Aborigines sought out emu fat. The Maasai consume, of course, lots of high-fat raw milk. And according to the work of nutritional pioneers such as Weston Price, mental illness was virtually unknown in these cultures. So, and let's not forget, we are Ice Age beings. Fat to us means survival. And I think hence the central role that leptin plays, leptin being fundamentally a fat sensor. It's all about survival. And if you don't have what it takes to survive, then everything else is secondary to that. Fat is critical to us, and our body will have its way. If we're not eating fat, our body's going to get really good at synthesizing it from other things in our diet, namely carbohydrates. However, unless you're eating it, if you're not eating it, you're not getting the variety of fats that can be so critical to optimal health and well-being. You can't do it all on palmitic acid. So, the consequences of a low-fat and low-cholesterol diet, and just start running through all of these things. Many people are familiar with the whole idea of a ketogenic diet for seizure-related disorders. And, it's now acknowledged in mainstream neurology. Somebody comes in with epilepsy that, of course, won't respond to medication or something, then they'll put them on what they call a ketogenic diets, which are these lovely little cans full of hydrogenated oils, and they're just in high fructose corn syrup and all kinds of junk. And of course, there are other ways of going about doing a high-fat diet. But just by virtue of going to a more ketogenic diet, a higher-fat diet, these seizures almost invariably improve, sometimes dramatically, sometimes they remediate entirely. But this is also true, and again, as a neurofeedback practitioner, I look at these things as part of a spectrum. And seizures are part of a spectrum of arousal we call unstable arousal. And there are other things that constitute unstable arousal too. There is mood lability. There are things like migraines, which are now being classified by neurologists as a form of slow seizure. And there are other forms of instability as well, bipolar disorder, whatever. Dietary fat is critical for these populations. So here we go, the ultimate brain fuel. Ketones are the energy units of fat, and they can supply us with the most steady and stable source of energy for the brain and also nearly all other bodily systems. And what tends to be taught in medicine, of course, and if you go to conventional, take a course, conventional course in nutrition and everything else, is that, well, you know, your brain has to have glucose, it has to have glucose, and everything has to have glucose in order to run. Well, as with many things, there is a conditional truth to that. It's true if and only if you have metabolically adapted yourself to depending on glucose as your primary source of fuel. But that's not the only option. And in fact, it's not the most natural option. It's not really the way we were designed. And in fact, I don't think nature would have ever been so stupid as to make us dependent on something so volatile and damaging as something like sugar. So just, you know, little visual to take away here. Nothing is more stabilizing to the brain than natural dietary fat. It is very even burning, and it burns a very long time. Even the most slender among us has enough body fat to probably go for a month. Not that I'd recommend it, but we have enough stored fat to be able to go a long time. This is the fuel that is the fuel for survival, and we can rely on it. If the food is scarce, we've got a steady supply of fuel. Sugar, on the other hand, if you're dependent on that, you've got to manage that. You've got to eat it, and then you've got to, you know, deal with the consequences of it going too low, and then you have some more, and it goes this, and so go your moods, so goes your neurological and cognitive functioning. It's no way to live. I mean, you can manage that if you want. I'd rather not be a slave to that. So omega-3s, real briefly, roles in mental health, essential to the normal mood and functioning of the human brain. Helps to modulate cortisol, which is a stress hormone level in the brain, needed for proper memory and cognitive functioning. And also note, arachidonic acid, GLA saturates, and other fats and cholesterol also have important roles to play in cognitive functioning. It's not all omega-3s, folks. I mean, there are other things happening in the brain, too. And statin drugs, again, by lowering cholesterol in the body and brain, can also result in memory issues and dementia-like symptoms in some individuals. In fact, that's one of the side effects listed on the packaging. Excessively low cholesterol is also known to impact mood and cognitive performance. So, of course, no diet will remove all the fat from your body because the brain is entirely fat. Without a brain, you might look good, but all you could do is run for public office. George Bernard Shaw. So depression. I come into the field of neurofeedback because I suffered from depression for about 35 years of my life before I stumbled across neurofeedback. And so this is an area near and dear and very close to my heart. Neurofeedback really did a tremendous amount to liberate me from that, and it's been a non-issue now in the last 15 years, or more now, which I'm very happy to say. But major depression alone is expected to be the second leading cause of disability by 2020 worldwide, second to only ischemic heart disease. And in just the United States, the lifetime risk for major depression is nearly a quarter of the population. Depression, again, may be viewed in many cases as the flip side of the anxiety coin. You see them together all the time. And it's very misunderstood. It's a state. Most people think you're depressed. You need to pull yourself up by your bootstraps and get moving and get some exercise and try to feel better. And really, what people don't realize is you're spinning your wheels. When I think of the amount of energy that it took me to get through a single day when I was depressed, I mean, it was a state of chronic efforting. I exhausted myself every day. So oftentimes what I see nowadays is a state of, in depression, of anxiety to exhaustion in people. And oftentimes it can be responsive, from my experience, by addressing things from the standpoint of anxiety. So other issues to consider. Diet in general, of course, are issues to consider with respect to this. Blood sugar, adrenal health. Got to whip through some of these. Thyroid, another thing. Anemia, again. Certain food deficiency or nutrient deficiencies, food sensitivities, again, and possible autoimmune processes, seasonal affective disorder, digestive issues, sleep disorders, life issues, circumstances, history of trauma, of course, you have to consider. But a depressed brain, of course, you can see is oftentimes characterized by severe hypoperfusion. And by the way, one of the things that is characteristic of a gluten sensitivity reaction is hypoperfusion to the brain, and particularly the frontal cortex. I'm just saying. Nutritional considerations, blood sugar issues, again. And again, it can lead to serotonin depletion. Yes, serotonin tends to be released when you eat something carbohydrate-based, but it doesn't give you anything to make more. And when you're chronically eating carbohydrates as a way of elevating your mood, you're fundamentally depleting your brain of that very neurotransmitter. Gluten sensitivity leads, again, to frontal lobe hypoperfusion and chronic microglial activation. That's your brain's immune system. Those inflammatory states, your brain doesn't have the brakes that the rest of the immune system in your body on the other side of the blood-brain barrier does. And so these inflammatory responses can persist in the brain, often for months, 6 months or more, in people that have this sort of thing chronically activated. So this is something for further discussion. I could really go off on this topic. Pull back the reins here. We only have a few minutes. Dehydration, again, is another one of those things, sometimes simple things you have to look at. Insufficient complete source protein intake. Again, vegetarian, vegan diets are very high carb diets. Can lead to diminished hydrochloric acid production and insufficient amino acids for the neurotransmitter synthesis. Essentially, excessively low-fat intake leading to EFA deficiencies, impaired neurological function, and absorption and utilization of fat-soluble nutrients. Huge. Mineral deficiencies such as zinc, magnesium, iron, which are normally essential for positive mood. So, ADD, yikes. Hey, look, a butterfly. And again, something that I see a ton of. Blood sugar dysregulation, again, food sensitivities, especially gluten, digestive disorders, heavy metal toxicity, anemia, diagnosed or undiagnosed thyroid issues. And so many of these things can tie in with food, including the heavy metal toxicity stuff. And I go into this, but not here, unfortunately. Nutrient deficiencies, and again, pyroluria, or some combination of the above. So again, back to gluten again. 70% of children with untreated gluten sensitivity or celiac disease show the exact same abnormal brainwave patterns as those with ADD. A study in the Journal of Attention Disorders stated that in 132 participants, all clinically diagnosed with ADHD, that's 100%, after at least 6 months on a gluten-free diet, all, and of course the emphasis mine, patients or their parents reported a significant improvement in their behavior and functioning compared to the immediate period before diagnosis and dietetic treatment. Can you imagine if a drug did that? Man, oh man, 100%. In the same study, they also stated that all ADHD-like symptomology patients should be tested for celiac disease with serum screening tests. Oh, please go to Cyrex labs for this. That's the gold standard now. The blood tests and serologic tests are typically only about 30% accurate. If you get a positive, you can take that to the bank. You get a negative, you don't know, because these things are so unreliable. As celiac disease could be one of the causes of these neuropsychiatric symptoms, we are convinced that celiac disease may predispose to important mental and behavioral disorders. Gluten sensitivity is known to affect, again, frontal lobe perfusion, and this can lead to subsequently impaired mood, memory, planning, judgment faculties, inhibitory capacity, and cognitive functioning. Improvement may typically be seen within several days to about 6 months of totally stopping gluten. So again, we already touched upon this. Cyrex Labs right now is the gold standard. They have something called an Array 3 panel, new gold standard in gluten sensitivity testing. Nobody comes close to them. There is a lab called Ancestral, which is a stool antigen test, about 6 times more accurate than any blood test. Anybody can order that online. With Cyrex, you do have to go to a licensed healthcare provider in order to order that lab. It is worth it, though. Okay, so nutrient deficiencies associated with ADD, again, ageless mind. Here's where the paleo model falls short. Our ancestors didn't necessarily select food based on what was healthiest for them or what was going to extend their lifespan the most. They were basically looking at a need for survival. And this makes the paleo model only a starting place, in my view, in the longevity equation. Now, if all you ever did was the paleo thing, really you'd be so far ahead of the game it'd be ridiculous. But I'm saying that there's a way of going beyond that and I think we need to go beyond that, actually, because of the world that we live in, our ancestors couldn't have even begun to fathom. We're up against things, and we're actually basically like boiling frogs. When you start listing all of the things that we're up against now, in our environment with our food supply, air and water, nutrient depletion of soils, and on and on and on, that there's just, you know, in my view, you can't look at the sort of the standard paleo thing as an endpoint. That I think that there are ways of manipulating those Paleolithic principles in a way that can better optimize our response to the world that we live in now. And I talk about that at great length in my book. So nature doesn't necessarily automatically guide us toward longevity enhancement or optimal health. Only modern science is really able to do this. So we can modify these in line with modern longevity research, which is one area I delve into quite a bit, which can lead to a whole new model for optimal physical brain health and a longer life. So how to take a good thing and make it better. One model that's worked consistently to improve health and longevity across species from yeast to primates is modified caloric restriction. Caloric restriction, as it turns out, is most effectively applied to carbohydrate and protein consumption. I'm not saying don't eat low protein. We need protein to be sufficient. It's just that we don't necessarily need to be eating slabs and slabs and slabs of meat. I don't know that our ancestors necessarily did that either. We do it where we can do it because we have this unnatural access to an unnatural abundance of food now, and our psychology is one of, you know, of feast or famine. But we need to, I think, look at this a little bit intelligently. This needs to be on nutrient density and minimization of insulin and mTOR levels, very low carb and moderate protein. And dietary fat, use that to satiety, serves to eliminate hunger, and fibrous vegetables and greens can be used to add desired bulk, you know, nuts and seeds and things like that. And this is not a high-fat diet per se, but it's a high-percentage fat diet. It doesn't take much fat to satisfy your appetite, but it's important that we get enough. So, this primate study, I was so excited to add this in my book. It's a 20-year-long study. It was just released this last year in the Journal of Science, and it was called Caloric Restriction Delays Onset and Mortality in Rhesus Monkeys. Two groups of Rhesus monkeys which were selected. One group were allowed to eat as much as they wanted, and the other group was given a sufficiently nutrient-dense diet with 30% fewer calories than one would normally consume. 20 years later, only 63% of the monkeys that ate as much as they wanted were still alive. 37% had died due to age-related causes, heart disease, cancer, or diabetes. And the caloric restriction group, 87% of them were still alive. Not just monkey business. Researchers confidently speculated that these findings would have considerable implications to combat aging and disease in humans. Throughout their lives, the calorically restricted group maintained superior health and age-related biomarkers in every area, including brain health. Also metabolic health and rate, insulin sensitivity, and cardiovascular vitality. The caloric restriction group enjoyed a threefold reduction in age-related disease, and they lost fat weight but maintained healthy levels of lean tissue mass. They additionally retained greater brain volume. Remember that glycated brain, which normally shrinks with age and glycation. But more than that, they retained superior cognitive function. This picture is worth 1,000 words. I went to great lengths to get this in my book. These were from the group that got to eat what they wanted, same age monkey from the group that was calorically restricted. You know, the pictures don't lie. Well, they can if they're CGI, but these are not CGI. So another exciting new study. In 2009, the Proceedings of National Academy of Science published a study entitled Caloric Restriction Improves Memory in Elderly Humans. In this study, German researchers imposed a 30% calorie restriction in the diets of elderly individuals and compared their memory function with a similar age group who basically ate whatever they wanted. At the conclusion of the 3-month study, those who ate without restriction experienced a small but clearly defined decline in memory function, while memory function in the group consuming the calorie-reduced diet actually increased and fairly profoundly. In recognition of the obvious limitations of current pharmaceutical approaches to brain health, the authors concluded, quote, "The present findings may help to develop a new prevention and treatment strategies for maintaining cognitive health into old age." And this here was the impact of caloric restriction versus omega-3 supplementation, and then these were the controls whose cognitive function actually declined. Extraordinary. So also, and I'm over time here, but I'm almost done. The study further stated, in animal models of aging and neurodegenerative diseases, caloric restriction protected hippocampal, striatal, and cortical neurons and ameliorated functional decline. And in longitudinal observations in humans, it was found that calorically restricted diet, as consumed by residents of the city of Okinawa, Japan, contributed to healthy aging and longevity. Furthermore, Reduced fasting insulin levels due to caloric restriction led to lower insulin resistance, higher insulin sensitivity, subsequently to improved insulin signaling in the brain, and to increased synaptogenesis and neuronal survival. And higher insulin sensitivity due to caloric restriction in our subjects with subsequently improved insulin signaling in the brain would be a plausible explanation for the observed memory improvements in the current study. So the moral of the story, in applying caloric restriction with optimal nutrition, in other words, not eating just like a kumquat tablespoon of oatmeal a day or whatever, but really making sure you're eating a nutrient-dense diet, is a means of taking the best and oldest tried and true diet. If it's a fad diet, folks, it's the oldest diet known to humankind, optimizing it for health and longevity, and also being able to afford it. I'm telling you, you will save hundreds of dollars a month. So the formula, elimination of dietary sugar and starch or anything that turns into sugar, in other words, minimization of insulin need, and that includes excess protein, which will convert to sugar, by the way. The moderation of protein intake, the inclusion of as much dietary fat as is needed in order to satisfy appetite and calm leptin. This amounts to not only not a high-fat diet, but a high-percentage fat diet. Please don't accuse me of doing a high-fat diet. The more liberal consumption of fibrous vegetables and greens, raw and cooked, for bulk and antioxidant value, which we may need more now than ever. And mental and physical health, again, are inextricably entwined. We see the world through this lens that is our blood sugar stability, our instability, our hormones, and our neurotransmitters, and these will, to a significant degree, color our perception and experience of the world. So there's nothing more stabilizing to the brain than healthy natural dietary fat, nothing more destabilizing than dietary sugar and starch. The more you can come to rely on ketones as your brain's primary source of fuel, the healthier and more stable your brain will be, and the more gracefully it will age. And modified caloric restriction, a nutrient-dense diet largely eliminating sugar and starch, moderate in protein, and abundant in fibrous vegetables and greens, and sufficient in natural dietary fat, adds a longevity and vitality bonus to both physical and cognitive function. And that ain't no monkey business. Now, let's go eat some lunch. Thank you very much for being patient.